Up next, we have an engaging keynote on unlocking the power of business contracts, leveraging data, AI, and smart contracts. To shed light on this topic, I would like to call on the stage Thaija Dickerson, co-founder of Kontrak IQ, to share her views on the topic. Give it up for Thaija, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Make sure I'm clicking this. There we go. How is everyone doing today? I am Thaija Dickerson, and I am the co-founder of Kontrak IQ. We are a guided contract lifecycle management solution provider. And just a little bit about myself, I am a legal engineer and a in-function innovator, which basically means that after 20 years in procurement and contracts, I've essentially taken all of that subject matter expertise and shifted it over into in technology. So within our software solution at Kontrak IQ, our foundation is based on technology. AI, which includes machine learning, natural language processing, deep learning, and analytics, the prescriptive and predictive analytics. And so what we essentially do is help companies unlock the data within their contracts, connect it to their business so that they are able to execute and perform contracts better and are able to glean insights to make more strategic decisions. So I know contracts is more of a legal thing for many people, but it is one of the fields that will transform and really receive a paradigm shift when data, AI, and even blockchain, as far as smart contracts, is added to the equation. So I actually want to share a little bit of how data, AI, and smart contracts will really transform the business contracts industry. So a little disclaimer, and if you've ever worked with attorneys, you know that whenever there's a talk about contracts, there has to be a disclaimer. So I'm going to read the disclaimer a little bit. I am not an attorney, and any information, insights, and ideas presented in this speech is not intended as legal advice. The purpose of this speech is to provide general information and to really raise awareness on the transformational potential of business contracts through AI, artificial intelligence, and smart contracts. And I'll add that notwithstanding the foregoing and hereby, blah, 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 to the end of that. So kind of just going into this speech today. So remember the good old days. I put there is when business could be done on a mere handshake. I honestly grew up around business and contracts. My father was in forestry. He actually owned a business where his business cut and trimmed trees. So, for example, if there was a tree growing over a house, to have it cut down so that it wouldn't fall on the house, or if there were storms, him and his crews would go in and help homeowners and businesses with this. So he would actually take us after school and sometimes on the weekends with him to work with his team. And I share that because it was an experience to see him engage with customers and potential customers on his services. And honestly, that's where I saw business kind of transactions happen at that time. It was really done on a handshake deal and trust, and honestly, a notepad. That notepad was like, the carbon copies where they had the white sheet, the pink sheet, and the yellow sheet, if anyone remembers those, with the little cardboard in between to separate the transactions. The deals were done with a handshake and a quote that solidified the agreement between the two parties. Now, just curious, has anyone ever been involved in a handshake deal where you and another party just confirmed a transaction or a trade and you just built it on trust and did a handshake? Anyone? Probably many of us. Or have seen, a handshake deal. And honestly, there's something about, even with computers and written contracts, that's something intimate about talking with another person about your terms of an agreement, looking at each other, and then shaking hands, really confirming the trust between the two parties. Now, if you've ever been in a handshake deal that has gone bad or seen one, you've probably seen too many. I wanted to share a little story about, I have a 7-year-old son, his name is Vincent, and he was actually involved in his first handshake deal gone wrong, I say. Him and a friend had discussed Pokemon cards, and in his mind, there was supposed to be a transaction that happened the very next day, and they were supposed to trade the Pokemon cards, and he was like super excited. I think he must have been dreaming about this Pokemon card switch, because he was ready the next day, dressed and like sitting at the door to go to school. But when he got to school, the transaction didn't happen. His friend did not remember the conversation happening that way. So he came home and he was a little distraught, and he was like, you know, he didn't remember what we agreed to. We fist bumped and everything. And honestly, the fist bump nowadays is just as good as the handshake. And he goes, I should have put it in writing. And I think many of us, when we have seen a handshake deal go wrong, the first instinct, or been involved in one, the first instinct is, I should have put it in writing. And so that's where we see a lot of the written agreements with terms and conditions really come into play. As I have essentially matured and got into the legal side of contracts, you also see that there's a level of complexity that comes with contracting that you really try to get down and capture within agreements. And so that is really the birth of the written contract. Businesses are complex, and there's a lot of different terms and conditions, and we try to formalize this in written agreements. That's where we get many times legal involved to help us draft the proper terms and to help mitigate the risk and compliance and regulation within these documents. But I'm sure many people have been involved in contracts or have seen contracts where there's still disputes on the terms or non-compliance or failure to execute. And there is that component that even with a written agreement, there's still a gap in the trust and execution and an involvement of disputes when dealing with contracts. I actually have this joke with my partner and husband, Jeff, that contracts are flat. And I think that, you know, when you look at a written contract, not in digital form, but in paper form, it looks flat. But what if I told you that contracts are flat because the way that we actually treat them? We sign them, we execute them, we put them somewhere in case something goes wrong, and then we pull them out to engage with the other party to enforce terms. But if I told you that contracts are actually really dynamic, and they're actually dynamic because if you pull the data out of the contract and actually make it available to businesses and tools within your ecosystem, it actually drives a lot of value. The problem is that contracts have been siloed from the business. They have really gone from being business documents to legal documents. And oftentimes, they sit with legal teams or they sit in drawers safely until something happens, but then they're not executing along with the business. And what businesses have found is that there's a leakage as a result of this poor contract management. So poor contract management statistically show a leakage between 9 and 15% of revenue loss each year. This is slowly killing companies, and they don't really know how to manage it without creating other risks. So they remain siloed with legal teams or safely within areas disconnected from the business. That's where if you make contract data available to the right people, to the right tools, to the right decision makers, it really transforms how business makes decisions, how they execute contracts, and how they drive value to organizations. And that's where your contract business intelligence comes in. So let me see if this let me go back, sorry. So in terms of contracts business intelligence, when you start looking at analytics, the type of analytics that actually comes out of contract data can be prescriptive or be predictive. So I'll use prescriptive as an example. Prescriptive analytics. When it came to the pandemic, I think that if you are involved in business or have contracts with attorneys involved, there was this scurry around trying to figure out what protections, what obligations, what rights you actually had for your business in the performance during this stressful time. When you have that contract data available, you can actually have the insights that you need to secure the rights, to secure the business continuity that businesses weren't able to secure without that contract data. And then when it comes to predictive analytics, companies can actually use their contracts data to do proper planning, proper resource planning of their legal teams and their contract pipeline. One of the biggest complaints that legal teams have in their business organizations are not being involved in the contract negotiations or discussions on time or in time enough to leverage the best position for the company. But when you're able to have the analytics and the insights available, you can actually create a pipeline of contracts for business needs to mitigate contract expirations, renewals, and create a business continuity that companies aren't able to capture today. And it's really an untapped value center to organizations, whereas legal has oftentimes been seen as a cost center to organizations. Once you start making contract data available within the organization, it actually shifts into a value center to the organization. Now shifting over to AI and how AI will essentially transform the contract management experience. So when it comes to AI, there's been a lot of talk in the concern of AI replacing people's jobs. And I think that the misconception is that AI doesn't replace people, it actually helps people be better and more efficient. And so when it comes to contracts, less than 10% of organizations, small and large, read their contracts and know their contracts' terms and perform them as they're written. But with AI, it can actually bridge the gap in most of the expertise that lacks within the organization, giving people the right data, the right information, and the right guidance to execute properly, to mitigate risk, to increase efficiency, and to really bridge the knowledge gap in execution. So when we talk about use cases, I think we talk about a lot of the analytics and the AI and how it will transform, but what does that actually look like? When it comes to contracts and processes, businesses will be able to execute faster. With process optimization, they'll be able to have the analytics and the insights that they need to secure better business, leverage better terms, and perform better. When it comes to contract reviews and negotiations, nowadays that seems to be a very burdensome and cumbersome process. But with contract data, you can actually glean insights on historical negotiations and actually use that information to leverage better positioning based on benchmarks or where you have clustering of certain contract terms to drive and leverage a better position with your negotiations. Also, risk. Risk is a spotty term when it comes to contracts, and we're not actively managing that. So with that visibility and that data, you can actually have that available to your compliance and risk teams to be actively mitigating and proactively managing the risk. Contract performance, ensuring that contracts are performing at the pace of business. I think that that is one of the largest gaps that occurs today, is that contracts are siloed, they're segregated from the business, and honestly with digital transformation, if it maintains that way, contracts will not be able to keep up with the speed of business, even with data, if we don't incorporate AI. The game changer will be smart contracts. And I thought there was going to actually be a talk on blockchain and introducing the concept of smart contracts. And that won't happen today. This will be something that we essentially move into. But if you're not familiar with smart contract, a smart contract is essentially an agreement between two or more entities that is in a form of computer code that can actually self-execute. Now, does that mean that you'll be able to take a full master agreement or a full agreement and put it into one single smart contract? Not necessarily. You can actually have it where it's broken down into multiple series of smart contracts to ensure that the contract is being enforced and executed that way. And I guess the one thing that I wanted to add there is that it almost seems like the contracts field and the technology field are in two different worlds, and they have been operating that way. But honestly, the baseline, if you start looking at computer code and contracts, both are really dependent upon if-then statements. If this happens, then that happens. When you look at an agreement, that's the entire foundation of it. And honestly, it's one of the closest fields that can be transitioned into code, if done in simplicity and clarity. So I wanted to build a little bit more on smart contracts. And as we essentially move into a faster pace of business and digital transformation, and as I'll use supply chain as an example. Supply chain has had a very good use case for blockchain. But when you see the use cases of blockchain for supply chain, it doesn't include the actual contracts. They're able to automate the whole process without the contract. But when you actually change a contract into a smart contract, now you can make it part of the full supply chain process, and the contract itself is not separated from the business. So at the pace that business is being executed, the contract can execute, confirm compliance, have cost savings, honestly remove intermediaries that exist today, where if you need something to be interpreted or executed in terms of the contracts, you have to go to legal to get that assistance. But with smart contracts, that can be done seamlessly through code. You also have the backups. How many people have had an issue and were looking for their contract and couldn't find a contract? And it's been notorious in different companies for having lost contracts. But with smart contracts, they'll be on the blockchain, and so you have default backups, and it really serves as a single source of truth and transparency on what the different parties have agreed upon, and be able to have that trusting relationship. You also move away from the manual eras of human execution with smart contracts, and you have autonomous execution. So not only have you built the contract within code, you can actually do business with people that you have not, or entities that you don't have a relationship with, and have a trusted environment that the agreement will be executed. And honestly, that is something that both the handshake and written contracts have never been able to really capture, is the trust and the executableness of contracts, where smart contracts will be able to capture. Now, kind of pulling everything together, I wanted to show how there's a collective potential of leveraging data, AI, and smart contracts that will essentially transition companies from having a siloed contracting function, or business contracts being siloed from their digital transformation, to essentially moving contracts to the core of their organization, being a driver of data to all functions and all applicable individuals that need to have the oversight of their contracts. So contracts are no longer a legal thing, it's a business thing, and it can serve as part of the single source of truth for organizations. Again, I wanted to move away from the thought that contracts are flat. They are really dynamic, intelligent entities, and they have a lot of potential to generate opportunities and value within organizations. But how do we get there? There seems to be this gap of how do we move from the archaic space that we have been working in terms of contracting to a more digitally transformed contracting function. I would say first, you have to embrace the change. And this is probably more towards the legal side, or the mindset on how contracts are actually executed. First, you have to focus on the data. If you focus on the data, you can actually bring contract value to the organization today with predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, and really bringing data, merging it with business data to really execute and perform efficiently. The next step, I would say, is incorporate automation and AI. Automation and AI will essentially shift in the mundane tasks that we actually see a lot today and a lot of people struggle with the whole contract process. Automation will ensure compliance and efficiency, and AI can help bridge the knowledge gap that we have today and really empower teams to execute contracts efficiently. And I would say the third, and you could even do this, on a personal basis, try your first smart contract. We are going into digital contracting, but there seems to be this mistrust that a transaction can actually be executed in program code between two parties. I invite you to just try it. Even within organizations, the first step is maybe just having a contract executed based on payment of an invoice or a scope of work. Being able to make these little steps in transitioning contracts into self-executing, value-driving entities is going to be transformational and a real paradigm shift within the contracting scope. A little bit about Kontrak IQ. We are actually a guided contract lifecycle management solution, which essentially means that we incorporate AI, data, and smart contracts so that companies can transition in this space from operating silo to really being the center and core of digital transformation within organizations by providing efficiency, value, and bridging the knowledge gap that exists today within organizations in terms of contracts. So that is the end of my presentation, but I invite you to connect with me. I have talked to many of you today, and I'm very thankful to be able to share my experience and thoughts in terms of contracts. I have a QR code. The presentation today is available on that site, but I will open the floor up if there's any questions in regards to the material that I've presented today. Yes. Thank you.
Do you have integrations with some of these other systems? Because oftentimes, when you're trying to recover it lost, like for example, you have a vendor, third-party vendor who agreed to do something with you. Mm-hmm. They don't perform as expected, or you set up a rate card and they had resources working on it that were below scope of what was originally agreed upon. Mm-hmm. So therefore they need to do an adjusted rate with the invoicing. But the problem is all this information sits in all different types of systems. Mm-hmm. So you're chasing the data. Mm-hmm. Like you have to go look up the contract. You have to look at JIRA to see the units and how they performed and the amount of time that they took. You have to correspond that back to the invoicing system. Mm-hmm. And they all sit in completely separate areas. So you're playing detective. Mm-hmm.
My question to you is, how much time does that take?
Oh, a tremendous amount of time. Especially, so I don't like to approve an invoice until I validate it. Mm-hmm. And I see my peers sometimes in the past just approving invoices, but that's lost income for the company because they're paying for things that they didn't actually receive. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is like, it's great that you have a smart contract, but then how does that system interact with other systems?
So even moving away from the smart contract, even just having the data and the integrations today, that helps minimize that time that you would have to take in order to first identify that there's an issue, find out where the issue is, and having that available to you to quickly execute or communicate to the other party that something needs to change. Integrations is core to our solution, because that's the only way that you can essentially make it part of the whole ecosystem of tools is through integrations.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions, thoughts? Well, I hope you learned something today. I am ecstatic about contracts, and I'm hoping that I shared a little bit of that spirit with you. There's a huge use case for it, so if you have learned something today, I ask you to share a little bit of that information in terms of digital transformation, contracts, and the value of contract data. Thank you.